The settlement lay along a narrow valley where timber had always been trusted more than ideas. Cabins stood squared and heavy, their walls stacked thick against snow that returned each year without fail. When the young man arrived, 18 years old and alone, he was watched in the way communities always watch someone new. He chose a plot near the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line, where wind slid down from the higher ground. Instead of raising full log walls, he set a low timber frame and stretched heavy canvas across it. He worked methodically, anchoring it tight, layering it where the wind struck hardest. To those passing by, it looked unfinished, like a shelter waiting for real walls that never came. A few settlers stopped to look, then moved on, shaking their heads. The settlement's most experienced builder spoke first, not with anger, but with certainty earned over decades. He said the canvas would tear, that cold would find its way through, that snow would press until the whole thing gave way. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Others repeated his words later, adding their own judgments in quieter tones. People said the boy was wasting time before winter. They said the valley punished shortcuts. They said a cabin was not a place for experiments. No one offered help beyond advice already given. The young man listened, nodded once or twice, and returned to his work without explanation. As autumn thinned, the signs of a hard season appeared early. Frost held longer in the mornings. The river skimmed with ice before it should have. Geese passed overhead in tight, hurried formations. Older settlers took note of these things and spoke of winters that came down fast and stayed longer than expected. The canvas cabin stood out more each day. Its pale surface caught light differently than wood, making it impossible to ignore. Children were warned not to lean against it. Men joked that it would serve better as a tent than a home. Someone said the first strong wind would answer all questions. The young man kept working alone. He adjusted ropes, reinforced seams, and weighted the lower edges with stone. He slept inside the frame before it was finished, rising early to continue. His age became part of the conversation, offered as explanation enough. At 18, people said, a man could not yet know what winter required. When the first distant storm clouds gathered over the ridges, the settlement turned its attention back to its own roofs and stores. The canvas cabin remained as it was, quiet and unconvincing. It stood there under open scrutiny, waiting for the season that would decide whether it was foolishness or something else entirely. No one could yet point to a clear danger, only patterns remembered and passed along. Winter had always been the measure of judgment here. Cabins that endured were remembered. Those that failed were spoken of briefly, then left out of future advice. In that quiet arithmetic, the canvas walls had already been counted wrong, long before snow ever touched them. The valley waited without comment, and so did the boy, working within sight of doubt that settled as steadily as the coming cold. It was already late in the year. Still, the young man continued his work without offering reasons. Each morning, he tightened lashings, checked seams, and reset stones where the ground had shifted overnight. When questions were directed at him, he answered only with what was necessary, often nothing at all. The cabin took shape through repetition rather than explanation, its form settled by practice instead of debate. The experienced builder returned more than once. He walked the perimeter, testing the earth with his boot and studying the slope above the clearing. He spoke of wind shear that came down the valley in winter, of snow that stacked and pressed until even seasoned roofs failed. His words were measured, not sharp. "Canvas lifts," he said once. "Snow loads break what cannot shed it." The young man listened, nodded, and went back to his hands. Neighbors talked when the boy was out of earshot. Some said he lacked the timber to do better. Others believed he was stubborn, mistaking silence for confidence. A few admitted they were curious, though curiosity carried no weight against habit. The settlement had survived by repeating what worked. Change was tolerated only after proof. Near the lower end of the clearing lived an elderly settler whose strength had thinned with the years. He relied on nearby cabins for help when storms closed the paths and firewood grew heavy. As autumn waned, attention turned quietly toward him. People checked his stores, measured his chimney draw, and noted how close he was to others should cold arrive early. The canvas cabin stood closest of all. Its door faced inward toward the settlement, not the trees. The young man cleared a narrow path between his place and the older man's door, tamping it firm before frost hardened the ground. No comment was made, but it was seen. Work continued through shortening days. The boy's hands stiffened in the mornings, warming only after steady motion. He added layers where canvas met frame, weighted edges with stone, and sealed gaps with care learned through trial. The authority figure watched from a distance now, his warnings already delivered. By late autumn, the first thin ice held in shaded places throughout the day. Breath showed longer with each passing week. The young man worked through it, finishing the last adjustments as geese passed low overhead. When the final lash was tied, the cabin was closed in completely. It was done before the first hard freeze. No announcement marked the moment. The canvas walls stood quiet, pale against darkening ground. People took note only in passing, measuring it against the weather yet to come. The elderly settler visited once, leaning on a stick, saying little beyond a nod of thanks for the cleared path. As nights grew colder, the settlement settled into its waiting. Stores were counted, doors were checked. The authority figure looked once more at the cabin and said nothing. The young man stopped building and began living inside the space he had made, rising each morning as before. Whatever reasons had guided his hands remained his own, unspoken and unchanged, held back like warmth kept close against a season that no longer felt distant. The settlement accepted this without ceremony. Silence was common before winter, a pause shared by people and land alike. No one pressed the boy for answers. Experience taught that explanations mattered less than outcomes. Wind moved down the valley more often now, bending grass flat and testing every loose board. The canvas cabin met it without sound. Observations were stored away, neither trusted nor dismissed. Winter would provide the only reply worth keeping. Until then, the valley watched, counted days, and kept its judgments deliberately unfinished. Autumn did not fade gradually that year. It collapsed. 1 week held dry ground and workable mornings. The next brought skies that stayed low and unmoving. Cold rain arrived first, driven sideways by wind that no longer followed familiar paths through the valley. The ridges redirected it, pressing it down into the clearing with steady force. Snow followed before most expected it. Not deep at first, but persistent. It fell wet and heavy, melting by day and freezing again by night. Tracks hardened into ruts. Doorsteps glazed over. The river's surface closed early, its sound dulling as ice thickened. Settlers turned inward. Log cabins were checked and rechecked. Roof seams were packed. Extra braces went up along walls that had stood unchanged for years. Firewood was stacked closer to doors, protected from drifting snow. Men worked longer hours, shoulders bent, saving effort where they could. The canvas-wrapped cabin drew renewed attention. Its pale surface took on stains from rain and sleet. Wind pressed against it, testing every tie. Those passing slowed to look. Some said the weather had already answered the question. Others said the worst had not yet come. The experienced builder added reinforcement to his own roof and spoke again, briefly, when he crossed paths with the young man. He pointed to the way wind now cut across the clearing, striking from an angle rarely seen. "It will find the seams," he said. There was no response beyond continued work. An animal moved with the young man now, a lean dog that had followed him since late summer. It slept near the cabin door, nose turned into the wind, rising at unfamiliar sounds. The dog's presence was practical. It alerted before others noticed shifting weather, and it shared warmth when nights fell below freezing. Supplies tightened as travel grew difficult. Trips to distant timber slowed. Hunting yielded less as animals moved lower or disappeared into cover. Stores were measured carefully. The elderly settler relied more heavily on nearby help as paths iced over. Short visits became routine, made quickly between storms. Snowfall increased. Wind patterns shifted again, no longer sweeping cleanly through but circling, building drifts where none had formed before. Fences vanished beneath white mounds. Doors opened with effort. Smoke from chimneys flattened and trailed along the ground instead of rising. The canvas cabin held its shape, though doubt gathered around it. People noticed how the material flexed under pressure, how snow slid instead of stacking. Still, no one said it meant anything. Settlers trusted weight and thickness. Flexibility looked like weakness. The young man adjusted when needed. He tightened lashings after storms and cleared drifts away from the base. He said nothing. His dog waited nearby, pacing when wind grew louder. Night came earlier now, bringing longer stretches of dark and quiet broken only by weather. The settlement settled into patterns meant for endurance rather than comfort. Meals shortened. Conversations did too. The valley no longer felt like a place waiting for winter. It felt occupied by it. Snow returned again and again, earlier than any recent memory suggested. Each storm left little time to recover before the next arrived. People stopped predicting when it might ease. They worked instead, reinforcing what they knew. Against that backdrop, the canvas-wrapped cabin stood unchanged, neither proving itself nor failing. It remained an object of concern rather than trust. The animal lay curled against its door. Smoke rose thinly from its vent when wind allowed. Supplies were counted inside, as they were everywhere else. Weather had taken control of the valley. Choice narrowed. Judgment was postponed. The season moved forward without pause, carrying doubt along with it, deeper into days that no longer offered room for correction. The storm arrived without the warning settlers were accustomed to reading. The morning opened gray but workable, wind low, snow thin enough to brush aside. By afternoon, the sky pressed down hard and close, and the air thickened in a way older men noticed without needing to speak. By dusk, the valley was sealed. Wind entered first, not as gusts but as sustained force. It moved down from the high ground and gathered speed as it narrowed through the trees. Snow followed immediately after, driven flat and fast, erasing paths and landmarks within minutes. Sound changed. What had been scattered noise became one continuous pressure. Cabins began to respond differently, according to how they were built. Smoke failed to rise, pressed back against chimneys. Roofs that had held for years groaned under uneven weight as snow packed into corners and froze. Doors strained against frames swollen with ice. Men moved between structures briefly, then stopped when visibility collapsed. The authority figure attempted one last circuit of the clearing before full dark. He tested a roof beam with his shoulder and felt it shift. He looked toward the lower cabins and judged the distance between them. Wind struck him hard enough to force a pause. He turned back, recognizing that movement beyond immediate shelter would not continue safely. By nightfall, evacuation was no longer possible. The paths were gone. Snow filled the air so densely that lantern light showed nothing beyond an arm's length. The decision was not spoken aloud. It did not need to be. Each household sealed itself in as best it could and waited. The elderly settler was checked one final time before the storm closed completely. His fire was burning low but steady. Extra wood was stacked close at hand. The visit was brief. Doors were shut carefully to keep hinges from tearing loose in the wind. Across the clearing, the canvas-wrapped cabin remained where it had stood all season. Wind struck it continuously, pressing the material inward and then releasing it again. Snow slid down its sides rather than piling deep. The dog stayed close to the door, shifting when gusts changed direction. Inside, the young man stayed put. He did not attempt to reinforce what was already finished. He adjusted only what could be reached safely, tightening a lashing near the base before retreating indoors. The door closed behind him and remained shut. As the night deepened, failures accumulated. A shed roof tore loose and vanished into darkness. A fence line collapsed under drifting snow. Somewhere in the storm, a shutter broke free and struck a wall until it split. Each sound traveled briefly, then was absorbed by wind. The authority figure listened from his own cabin, counting impacts and measuring time between them. He understood what those sounds meant. Experience told him that survival now depended on endurance rather than action. The storm had committed fully. Cold followed the wind. Temperature dropped steadily. Unnoticed at first beneath movement and noise, fires were fed more often. Water containers were checked repeatedly to keep them from freezing solid. Breath showed thick even indoors. The canvas cabin responded differently. Wind pressure flattened sections of wall, then released them without damage. Snow that struck did not hold. Inside, the space remained tight and controlled. Heat stayed close. The young man tended his fire carefully, reducing smoke when draft faltered. The dog lay pressed against the wall where warmth collected. Hours passed without marker. Darkness and weather erased time. The settlement endured as separate islands of light surrounded by force that did not weaken. No one stepped outside again. Decisions had already been made. By the latter part of the night, the storm settled into a sustained state rather than escalation. This was its true form, steady and punishing. The authority figure understood then that whatever survived until morning would shape how the valley remembered this winter. Structures would be counted. Methods would be judged. The young man remained where he was, awake through much of the night, listening as canvas and wind argued without resolution. He did not know what was failing beyond his walls. He knew only what held. Outside, the valley disappeared beneath snow and pressure. Inside, each shelter waited for daylight that felt distant and uncertain. The storm did not announce when it would pass. It only stayed, filling the night completely, leaving no space for doubt, movement, or correction. Morning came slowly, not with light, but with a thinning of sound. The wind eased first, losing its edge, then its force. Snow still fell, but straight down now, settling instead of striking. When doors were finally opened, it was done with caution, hinges creaking under weight they were not built to bear. The settlement revealed itself in pieces. Roof lines sagged where snow had frozen solid overnight. One log cabin near the eastern edge had collapsed inward. Its center beam split cleanly under pressure. Another stood open to the sky, half its roof torn away and buried somewhere beyond the clearing. Smoke did not rise from every chimney it had the night before. People moved carefully, marking safe paths with boots and poles. No one spoke much. Effort was directed toward checking fires, counting people, and identifying those who could not remain where they were. Judgment about causes did not surface. Survival took precedence. The authority figure emerged late, having spent the night reinforcing his own walls as best he could. He surveyed the damage without comment. Experience showed him enough to know which structures would not be used again this season. He did not correct anyone. He gave instructions where needed and listened where he could not. At the lower end of the clearing, the elderly settler's cabin had held, but barely. Snow had pushed hard against one wall, and the interior cold had deepened during the night. His fire had gone out near morning. When his door was opened, the air inside carried the weight of long hours without heat. The young man reached him first. He cleared snow from the doorway with steady movements and offered no explanation. The decision was practical. The canvas cabin stood closest, and it still held warmth. Moving the elder took time. Steps were measured. Breath came short. The dog stayed close, circling and pausing as if marking space. The canvas cabin's door opened inward without resistance. Inside, the air felt contained. The fire had not failed. The elder was settled near the wall where warmth gathered. A blanket was added. Water was warmed slowly. There was no conversation beyond necessity. "Sit," was said once. "Here." Once more. Nothing else was required. Others followed as damage became clear. Two neighbors whose roof had partially failed arrived with what they could carry. They did not ask to stay. They were told where to place their packs. The space adjusted without protest. Canvas flexed as bodies shifted inside, responding without complaint. Outside, the settlement reorganized itself around loss. Tools were recovered where possible. Snow was cleared from doors that still opened. Fires were restarted where fuel allowed. The authority figure moved between groups, making short decisions and leaving them to be carried out. What endured became evident through use rather than inspection. The canvas walls bowed and returned, shedding snow that slid away instead of accumulating. Wind moved across them now with less force, finding no fixed edge to seize. Heat stayed within a narrow range, enough to matter. No one commented on it directly. Attention remained on people. Food was divided. Water was rationed. The elderly settler remained awake, eyes open, breathing steady. That alone was considered success. By midday, the storm's work was fully visible. 2 structures were written off entirely. Others would require weeks of repair. The canvas cabin, still standing, was no longer described as temporary. It was described by function alone. The authority figure entered once, standing near the door. He looked around, took in the conditions, and nodded. "It holds," he said. Nothing followed. He left without waiting for response. The young man returned to tending the fire. He added fuel sparingly, conserving what he had. The dog settled again near the wall. The space remained quiet except for breath and the low sound of burning wood. Judgment did not disappear. It was replaced. Survival reordered priorities quickly and without argument. What had failed was noted. What endured was used. The settlement adjusted its shape around that reality, guided not by opinion, but by what the storm had allowed to remain standing. When the storm finally withdrew, it did so without ceremony. The wind eased into stillness, and snow fell straight for a time before stopping altogether. What followed was not relief, but but a careful quiet. People waited before moving, as if sound itself might return the weather. Assessment began slowly. No one crossed the clearing without reason. Snow was cut away in narrow channels, revealing damage piece by piece. Roofs were tapped with poles before being trusted. Walls were leaned against before entered. The work required patience more than strength. The authority figure took his time. He walked the settlement in a deliberate circuit, noting where beams had shifted and where weight had broken what age had not. He gave no lectures. He had seen enough winters to know that explanation followed observation, not the reverse. When he reached the canvas-wrapped cabin, he stopped longer than before. He pressed a hand against the wall, feeling its give, then stepped back to watch how it returned to shape. He followed the seam lines with his eyes, tracing where snow had slid away rather than held. No comment was made. The inspection was thorough and quiet. Others noticed. They did not gather close, but they watched from a distance, carrying tools, hauling timber, resuming tasks delayed by weather. No one laughed now. No one repeated earlier judgments. The cabin had become part of the landscape rather than an object of debate. Repairs began elsewhere using what had been learned. Roof angles were adjusted where possible. Snow-shedding surfaces were favored over flat ones. Extra supports were placed where drift had collected. Canvas appeared in small ways, stretched over joints, layered where wind had entered before. No one announced these changes. They simply appeared. The elderly settler remained housed near the canvas cabin, regaining strength slowly. His original shelter was reinforced enough to be used again, but not trusted fully. Short distances were measured carefully. The young man continued to check on him without comment, clearing paths when needed, and then returning to his own work. The young man himself offered no explanation to anyone. When spoken to, he answered briefly, often with a nod instead of words. He did not describe his choices or defend them. He resumed routine tasks, splitting wood, tending fire, repairing small wear from the storm. The dog stayed close, moving with him as before. The authority figure returned once more, standing just inside the cabin's doorway. He looked around at the space, the controlled warmth, the way air moved without pulling heat away. He nodded once. "Useful," he said. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. He left immediately after. Days passed in this manner. Snow remained deep. Travel stayed limited. Work focused on making what stood more reliable rather than replacing what was lost. The canvas cabin was no longer referenced as unusual. It was referenced when solutions were needed. Silence followed the wind in more than weather. Conversations changed tone. Where earlier there had been certainty, there was now restraint. People spoke less about how things should be done and more about what it endured. The young man did not become central to discussion. His age remained what it was. He was not elevated or consulted formally. His work was simply present, available to be studied by those who wished. That was enough. By the time routine returned in small measure, the settlement had already adjusted its thinking. No meeting marked the change. No agreement was reached aloud. The storm had delivered its record, and it was read without argument. The canvas walls stood pale against the snow, marked now by use rather than doubt. The young man moved in and out as required, unchanged in manner. Silence held where wind once had, and within that silence, the settlement continued, altered not by words, but by what remained standing when the weather had finished speaking. The remainder of winter passed without another storm of equal force, but cold remained constant. Snow stayed deep, compacted by time. rather than wind. Days shortened further, then slowly began their return. The settlement adjusted its rhythm to endurance, working within limits the season imposed. Changes appeared quietly. A roof was reworked with a steeper pitch. Canvas was stretched over a repaired wall before planks were set back in place. Layers were added where gaps had once been accepted. These decisions were made individually, without discussion, guided by observation rather than instruction. No one credited a source. The authority figure did not call meetings or issue recommendations. He watched the work being done and allowed it to continue. Experience had taught him that methods adopted under pressure held longer than those agreed upon in comfort. The canvas cabin remained occupied and unchanged in purpose. The young man rose at the same hour each day, tended his fire, split wood, and cleared snow when needed. He assisted where asked and declined when it was unnecessary. His manner did not shift with the settlement's behavior toward his work. Repairs elsewhere increasingly reflected what it held. Flexible surfaces replaced rigid ones where possible. Weight was redirected rather than resisted. Snow was given paths to slide instead of corners to gather. These adjustments were small, but they accumulated. The elderly settler returned to his own cabin when conditions allowed. He moved slowly, supported when needed, and kept his fire modest but steady. His shelter now bore added layers, canvas included, placed without comment. The path between cabins remained clear throughout winter. Respect showed itself in imitation. No one spoke to the young man about what he had done differently. No one asked him to explain. Instead, eyes followed his methods when he worked, and hands repeated them later elsewhere. The dog continued its watch, moving easily between structures, accustomed now to the settlement's altered shape. It rested where warmth collected and alerted when unfamiliar sounds broke the stillness. Its presence remained practical, unremarked. Midwinter brought stretches of clear sky and hard cold. Ice held fast. Breath crystallized in the air even at midday. Fires burned longer and fuel dwindled. Yet fewer repairs were needed than earlier in the season. Structures held their form. The authority figure passed the canvas cabin often during these weeks. Sometimes he paused briefly, other times not at all. He never entered again. His silence carried weight without requiring words. As the season wore on, what had once been considered unusual became ordinary. Canvas ceased to draw attention. Layering became habit. Flexibility replaced stubbornness in small but lasting ways. The young man remained 18 through the winter, unchanged by the settlement's acceptance of his work. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not correct misconceptions or claim influence. His actions remained limited to what the day required. By late winter, the settlement functioned differently than it had before the storm. The change had no name and no moment of decision. It existed only in practice, repeated daily, sustained by results. No apology was offered for earlier doubt. None was requested. Survival had rendered the matter settled. The season continued, and the settlement endured within it, shaped quietly by what had proven useful when tested without warning. Years later, when the valley had changed shape and the settlement no longer felt new, the winter was still spoken of. Not often, and not with raised voices. It surfaced in measured recollections, usually when weather turned early or snow lingered longer than expected. The witness who remembered it best was an older man by then, someone who had been young enough to work that winter, and old enough now to have seen many since. He spoke of the storm not as a disaster, but as a correction. It had shown the settlement what it had assumed and what it had failed to test. He recalled how buildings were counted after the wind passed, not by how they looked, but by whether they could still be used. Some were never repaired, others were altered beyond recognition. Those choices, he said, lasted longer than the storm itself. When the canvas cabin was mentioned, it was done plainly. There was no embellishment. It had stood. It had stayed warmer. People had taken shelter there. That was all that needed saying. No one claimed it had been perfect, only that it had worked when others had not. The witness remembered the young man clearly, though the details were sparse. He recalled that the builder had been 18 years old at the time, young enough to be doubted. He had not argued with anyone. He had not explained himself. He had worked, and then he had waited. The storm, the witness said, taught the settlement to pay attention to outcomes rather than assurances. After that winter, people built with an eye toward movement and release instead of resistance alone. Canvas became common, not as novelty, but as tool. Layering was no longer considered wasteful. Flexibility was understood as strength. He did not describe the changes as sudden. They came slowly, like habits formed after injury. The winter was not remembered for the noise of wind or the depth of snow, but for the silence that followed when decisions were made without argument. The canvas cabin itself did not become a landmark. It aged, was repaired, and eventually was taken down. No marker was left behind. What remained were methods, passed quietly to those who built later. The witness noted that stories often grow larger with time, but this one had not. It stayed small, contained by fact. A storm came early. Some structures failed. One did not. People adjusted. That was the record. When asked why the young man was remembered, the witness paused. He said it was because the lesson had arrived without instruction. No one had been persuaded. No one had been corrected aloud. The weather had done the teaching. The valley carried on after that, shaped by many seasons. New settlers arrived who did not know the names of those who built first. They learned instead by copying what held. In that way, the winter endured longer than memory alone could manage. The witness ended his account without emphasis. He said only that the settlement survived because it learned when it was forced to. The canvas cabin was part of that learning, recorded as fact, not legend. The young builder's age was remembered because it explained the doubt, and nothing more.